Good morning, guys. I hope you are well. This is another video from me on cell specialization. So this is part two. So if you haven't seen part one, go back and watch it, please. Thank you very much. It's all related to animal cells. So we go through sperm cell, nerve cell, and the muscle cell. However, in this video, what we're going to do is look at plant cells, understand how root hair cells work, xylem tissue and phloem tissue, and how kind of they function and help the plant do what it needs to do. If you haven't subscribed, please, of course, go subscribe on YouTube, follow on Facebook page and on Instagram. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I promise. The question I want to pose to you and the thing that I want to ask you really is, how do plants do everything that plants do without a brain? And it's kind of, when you think about it, it's actually really weird. Like, plants are essential to life across the planet. However, when we think about plants, we don't necessarily think of them as sentient beings, because they're not. They don't have a brain. They don't think about what it is that they're doing. So actually, what plants need to do is adapt to the environment that they're in, and it all comes down to one word, which is adaptations. Because we know that particles move around constantly. They're moving around randomly, according to Brownian motion, and plants need to work out, or rather they have worked out. When I say worked out, they're not thinking about it, but plants have adapted over a long period of time, very long period of time, to be as efficient and to optimize exactly what it is that they need to get from the environment, as well as inside, in terms of their own structures, to be able to be as efficient as possible. And that's really, really interesting when you think about, kind of the history of evolution, but we're not going to go into that now. All right. What we're going to talk about, though, more specifically, is adaptations and what adaptations plants have. We're just going to talk about a few of them. Now, ultimately, what is the process that plants need to go through? It's photosynthesis, right? So the two things that plants need are carbon dioxide and water, and obviously sunlight for the energy to actually carry out photosynthesis. However, those two things, in terms of carbon dioxide, we know that carbon dioxide comes from the air, and it doesn't matter whether it's a big tree or a small plant, carbon dioxide always comes from the air. And then when we think about water, it always comes from the roots, so up this way, yeah. But in terms of the water coming in through the roots, we actually need to get the water from the roots all the way up to the leaves, because that's where photosynthesis takes place. And so that kind of flow of water is called the transpiration stream, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But I just wanted to kind of point that out and highlight that for you, transpiration, at the beginning of the video. So that's kind of in your mind, and you're thinking about that all the way as we go through the video. All right, so let's have a look at this. The three kind of things, cells and tissues, that we're going to look at are root hair cells, phloem tissue, and xylem tissue. So root hair cells are obviously in the roots. They are, that drawing there, that's amazing. Take a moment. Root hair cells, it looks like a seagull, I know, but actually what it's meant to kind of represent, what it's meant to show, is obviously you've got the cell wall there. This is meant to represent the vacuole. This thing here, which looks like an eye, is actually meant to be the nucleus, and you've got the cytoplasm there. Notice how there's no chloroplast in the root hair cell. However, there's lots of, and I haven't drawn them in, but there's lots of mitochondria, okay, because they need to release energy through respiration in order to carry out active transport. I'll talk about that in a second as well. So the function of root hair cells is to absorb water and minerals from the soil. Now, keep in mind, water and minerals. The reason why I've underlined them and I've bolded them is because they happen through two different processes. Okay, well, let's get rid of that. So, let's go with three. Three adaptations of a root hair cell are that they are long, so in other words, they have a large surface area, they have lots of mitochondria, and they are thin. Okay, so have a think about that. I want you to, if you can, pause the video. You should be able to. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to. Pause the video and tell me, how do those features help the plant to carry out its function? Okay, have a think. Right, so when you pause the video, when you had to think about it, hopefully what you should have kind of picked up, what you should have kind of tried to link it to, is absorption of water and mineral ions. And those two things are absorbed through kind of two processes, osmosis and active transport. So with a large surface area, It allows the plant to reach further to absorb water and nutrients. So the further the root hair cell can kind of reach, the better opportunity it has to be as efficient as it can to absorb the particles. It has lots of mitochondria, therefore it carries out respiration, and it needs respiration. It needs the energy from respiration in order to carry out active transport. Now, mineral ions are a very high concentration inside the cell. No, try that. Mineral ions are in a very high concentration inside the cell and a very low concentration outside the cell. Yeah, and so we need to move them against the concentration gradient. If you don't quite understand how that works, go watch the video on active transport. It's been uploaded, so that should be good to go. Okay, and finally, they are thin. In other words, they have a very small diffusion distance that particles need to go through in order to get into the cell. And that's an ideal situation because it means that it's got smaller diffusion distance, therefore it's more efficient in absorbing particles from the soil. Okay, right. Hopefully that made sense. If it doesn't, pause, go back. I'm going to move on to the next type of cell. You ready? 3, 2, 1. So the second thing we're going to talk about is the xylem tissue. And the xylem tissue is this series of dead cells that have kind of connected together. And the idea behind them is that they transport water from the roots all the way up to the leaves where photosynthesis takes place. So what is the main function of the xylem tissue? Well, it carries water and mineral ions from the roots to the leaves. Okay. Water and mineral ions, keep that in mind, is very, very important. And I'll tell you why in a second when we compare it to phloem cells, phloem tissue. So in terms of its features, it's got no cell walls at the end and it has thickened cell walls. So the cell walls on either side are slightly thickened, which mean that it provides great support, which I'll talk about in a minute. In terms of no cell walls at the end, it forms a continuous hollow tube. So if you think about it, if you had a hose pipe and you put loads of little gratings in the middle, then it doesn't really work. It slows down the flow of water. However, if you've got no ends at either end or if you've got nothing blocking the transport of water through this hose pipe, then actually the water is going to move through much more efficiently, which is exactly what the plant wants. In terms of the thickened cell walls, what they do is they provide support for the plant, particularly as the plant gets bigger and it gets taller and it has to reach higher heights. What you need is the plant to be able to stay upright, because that's where, if the leaves are at the top, that's where most of the sunlight will be. It provides support to the stem and it improves transpiration, so it allows the water to flow through much easier. Okay, so if you think about it again, we're trying to get the water from the roots all the way up the tree to the leaves, and that's kind of the xylem tissue is key in actually allowing the tree or the plant to do that. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is the phloem tissue. Now the phloem tissue is kind of similar, and these are the two often that get confused. However, the phloem tissue kind of is almost like the human body's circulatory system, in the sense that it transports key nutrients from the leaves back to the rest of the plant. So it transports organic nutrients from the leaves to the plants. What do I mean by organic? I mean things that are ultimately things that help it to stay alive. So we're talking about carbon-based molecules. In terms of the key features of phloem, phloem cell or phloem tissue, what you can see here, so it's got a sieve tube element at the top. It's got companion cells, and I'll talk about companion cells in a second. It's got a lateral sieve area as well, which I'll explain as well. So the sieve tube is at the end, okay, and the companion cells. There are two key features. So in terms of the sieve tubes at the end of the cell, they connect to the cytoplasm for easier transport. So again, it's kind of like having, in order to transport sugar molecules and in order to transport other organic nutrients from one place to another, you want that flow to be as easy as possible. Now the phloem will have these sieve plates which allow molecules to move through much easier. Also, they don't have a nuclei. Okay, so they don't have a nucleus, and that means that they have more cytoplasm space to allow the movement of substances. Now, if they don't have a nuclei, I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, how do they repair? How do they replace cells that are not working? How do they, do all those things that nuclei help cells to do? Well, they've got companion cells. So the companion cell is dependent. Sorry, the sieve element is dependent on the companion cell. Okay, and it's really, really important when you consider this, because actually what that means is it allows the sieve element to just almost be this continuous kind of hollow tube of cytoplasm, which allows the transport of organic nutrients, which is exactly what the plant wants to happen. Now, one of the things that you may be asked to do is compare phloem and xylem tissue according to the solutes that they're carrying. Okay, so it's kind of like comparing blood, arteries and veins. So what's the key difference between them? Well, arteries are going to have much more oxygenated blood, and your veins are going to have deoxygenated blood as well as more carbon dioxide. So when we compare the two, or rather when we're comparing the two in terms of plants, we've got phloem tissue and xylem tissue. So what are the key differences? And we can look at a similar thing. If I took fluid from both the phloem and the xylem and I didn't tell you which one's which, could you work it out? And that's one thing that you may be asked to do in an exam situation. So if we look at fluid A, we can see that it's got a very high amount of sugar, it's got very high amounts of nitrate ions, but not very much potassium ions. And then if I compare that to fluid B, then actually it's not got much sugar at all. It's got some nitrate ions, but it's got a much higher concentration of potassium ions. Okay, now if I had to work out which one's which, well, I would say that fluid A is from the phloem, because it's got a much higher concentration of sugar, and we know that phloem tissue is used to transport organic nutrients, nutrients being the key thing. And we know, and kind of the second bow to that string, or whatever the saying is that potassium fluid B contains a much higher concentration of potassium ions, which are absorbed from the root hair cells and they're transported up to the leaves because that's where they're needed. Okay, so one of the key things that you need to be able to do is work out which one's which according to the solutes that tissue carries. Now, as always, some example exam questions. I want you to pause the video. I want you to see how many of these you can answer by yourself, and if you can't, that's right, I'm going to go through them anyway. All right, but genuinely try and pause it and have a go and see how much you can do. Okay, see you in a second. So I'm going to go through the answers. Why is active transport necessary in plant root hair cells? So what do we know about active transport? Well, clearly it needs mitochondria in order to, it needs energy in order to take place, and therefore it requires mitochondria. Why is that needed? Well, actually we need to move something against its concentration gradient, and therefore whatever we're absorbing needs to be in a lower concentration outside the cell and a higher concentration inside the cell. So because mineral ions are needed by the plants are in higher concentration inside the cell, therefore, mineral ions need to move against the concentration gradient. Okay, so again, if you need more explanation on that, go watch the video on active transport. Describe two features of a root hair cell which make it adapted to carry out its function. Well, you could choose any of the two that you took down in your notes. However, two that kind of spring to my mind are, or the two that I chose really, were that it's long, which means it has a larger surface area, and it contains lots of mitochondria, which allow it to carry out respiration for active transport, what I referred to earlier in question number 1. However, one thing that I want you to notice is it says describe two features. So I haven't explained it, I haven't linked it to its function. I've just said what the two features are, and I've kind of given a description about them. Okay, so just be clear in your head the difference between describe and explain. Now, next one, name two substances transported by the xylem tissue. Well, think about it, go back to your notes if you need to. The two things that we need to get from the roots up to the leaves, because that's what the xylem does, are going to be water and mineral ions. If you want it to be specific and say potassium ions, that's fantastic, well done, you get the mark. What is translocation when referring to transport in plants? Now, this is one thing that I didn't go over in much detail in the actual bulk of the video. However, when we talk about translocation, we're talking about moving nutrients, moving sugar molecules from one place in a plant to another. So if you think about the movement of sugar molecules from the leaves, where the sugar is made through photosynthesis, to the rest of the plant. So for example, fruits taste amazing and they taste sweet, but the reason they have sugar in them is because the sugar that was produced during photosynthesis, fructose, that got later converted to fructose, is stored in the fruit of the plant. So I don't want to go over, hence why I'm going to say like, subscribe, please. It really helps support the channel. Thank you very much for your time, and look after yourselves. Be safe. That note though, oof, beautiful. Follow on the socials. Bye.